In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Isn't that true? That if we start to look for it, we start to see God's faithfulness. And as we look back, we see, wow, God, everything I have needed, you have provided for me. If we start to look back, we really start to see his faithfulness. And that's beautiful. Well, I'm Josh. I'm one of the pastors here, and I'm glad to be with you online. You're welcome to go ahead and find the Book of Haggai, because today we're going to be launching back into our study through the minor prophets. And we took a little break for Palm Sunday and Easter, but we're excited to see how these 12 books finish out as part of Israel's story. But I wanted to open with another story. There was a professor, and one day he showed up to his philosophy class, and he didn't say a word, but he just started taking objects from behind his desk and setting them on top of it. Then he began to fill the jar, a jar that he set out there. It was a large glass empty mayonnaise jar, an old mayonnaise jar, and he set it up there on the desk, and he proceeded to fill it with golf balls. And then he asked the class, "Is the jar full?" And they agreed that it was. But then he pulled out a box of pebbles from behind his desk, and he poured those and shook it so the pebbles fell in and filled in between the golf balls. And he said to the class, "Is it full?" And they agreed that it was. Well, then he pulled out a bag of fine sand, and he started to pour the sand in and wiggle the jar so the sand fell into each little crevice between the pebbles. And he says, "Now is the jar full?" And they said, "Yes, it is." Finally, he pulls 2 cups of coffee out from behind his desk and pours the entire contents into the jar. And now the class is just laughing. But as the laughter subsided, the professor said, "I want you to understand that this jar, it represents your life. The golf balls are the things that are really important, that are the highest priority. These are your family, your community, the God you worship. These are the things that if everything else wasn't there, your life would still be full. The pebbles, they're the things that are still important but take a back seat. They're your job, they're your home, they're your car, the things you need to take care of. And the sand is everything else. Now, if we put the sand into the jar first, there's no way you're going to fit those golf balls and pebbles. If you put the sand in first, there's no room for anything else. So take care to mark your priorities, to know what goes into your life first, what gets first seat. If you have your priorities wrong, you can't fit everything in life. Well, then a student raised her hand and said, "Well, what about the cups of coffee?" And the professor just chuckled and said, "That's just to show you that no matter how full your life is, there's always time for a couple of cups of coffee with an old friend." So I thought that was a pretty fun story that gets us thinking on the topic of what is important in life, what is central to life, what are really our priorities, because a lot of times we just get caught up in the busyness and the little things we have to do, and before you know it, our life is full of sand. For the people of God, there was something that was central to their lives. It was their God. It was Yahweh. It was the Lord. But that was really symbolized and came home in the temple. And the temple was central to the people of God. It was the center of their religious worship, but it was the center of their lives. And so today in Haggai, we're going to be learning a lot about the temple at a certain stage in the history of the Jews. But I just wanted to quickly give you a timeline. So in 1000 BC, Solomon built the temple, and this temple was incredible. This temple was overlaid with gold. It had every bell and whistle you could think of. And that was there for a while, but 400 years later, in 600 BC, Babylon actually came and conquered Judah. And they defeated most of the cities and basically took a lot of the people of God into exile. And they made them come live in Babylon as a way of asserting their power and making sure they had control. Then about 14 years later, 586 BC, they actually destroyed the temple. Up to that point, they had ransacked the temple, the Babylonians, and they had taken the gold, but they hadn't actually destroyed it. But then they actually burned it and turned it into a ruin, took any bronze object that was left, anything of value, and stripped the temple. And so the people of God didn't have a temple, and they were off in exile, stuck in Babylon. But then, in about 540 BC, a little bit down the road, a new power came onto the scene. It was Persia, and Persia overtook Babylon. And so when Persia comes in charge, they say, all these Jews living in Babylon, you guys don't have to live here. You can return to your land. Go ahead, leave, return. And so some of them decided to stay because they already had roots in Babylon, but many of them decided to come back. And so there was this resurgence. And they actually started even rebuilding the temple, and it was really exciting, but then they hit some roadblocks, and so they gave up. So they were back in the land, and life was pretty good. Well, today we're in the book of Haggai, and Haggai is about 20 years after the people have returned to the land. And it's the first of the post-exilic prophets, which just is a way of saying the prophets that spoke and did their ministry after the exile. So the people of God have returned to Israel, to Judah. And so that's where we pick up in the story today. And what we're going to find is we're going to read 4 messages from God. It's a short 2-chapter book, but God gives 4 messages to the people living in Judah. So let's go ahead and jump in. Haggai chapter 1, verse 1. In the 2nd year of King Darius, on the 1st day of the 6th month, the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest. So these are 2 characters that you can find in the book of Ezra. They're part of the story of what's going on in restoring Judah. But they're really the leaders of the people, and they get addressed a lot of times in here. So it's Zerubbabel, he is the governor of Judah. So they don't have a king anymore because they're not in charge. Persia's still in charge. But they still have their own government in Judah and Jerusalem. So Zerubbabel is the governor. And then there's Joshua, the high priest, which is not the Joshua we read about in the book of Joshua, but just another man named Joshua. And now God shares his message. And this is the first message that God is going to share with the people. He says, you have a priorities problem. That's what God's saying. He's telling them, you have a priorities problem. And my worship comes before your prosperity. And we're going to see that as we keep reading. Verse 2. This is what the Lord Almighty says. These people say, the time has not yet come to rebuild the Lord's house. Then the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Is it time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while this house remains a ruin? Now this is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. You have planted much, but harvested little. You eat, but you never have enough. You drink, but you never have your fill. You put on clothes, but are not warm. You earn wages, only to put them in a purse with holes in it. So first he gets inside what they're thinking and what they're saying. And they say, the time has not yet come to rebuild the house of the Lord. The time has not yet come to rebuild the temple. And for whatever reason, they're saying it's not yet the time. And this is their excuse. This is their rationalization for putting that on hold. And they might have had some, fairly good excuses, which are halfway true. But they just say, it's not time yet. But then God challenges that. He says, is it time for you to be living in a completed home? in a home where it may not be fancy, but you have the paneling up. It's a complete restored home. You can live there, but you're not taking care of my house, of my temple. And so basically he's saying you have a priorities problem. They're not putting God first. They're not putting God's kingdom at the center of their lives. And so he says that because of that, you've noticed you haven't been experiencing my blessing, have you? You drink, but you're never really satisfied. Or you plant and the harvest is pretty pathetic. He's like, haven't you noticed you haven't been experiencing my blessing? And so how are the people going to respond to God's call to take action and start building the temple? Well, compared to the other minor prophets, we're kind of shocked by how the people of God respond. Look at verse 13. Then Haggai, the Lord's messenger, gave this message of the Lord to the people. Verse 13 here. I am with you, declares the Lord. Is there anything better God can say to his people than I am with you? He says, I'm with you. Verse 14. So the Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and the spirit of Joshua, son of Josadak, the high priest, and the spirit of the whole remnant of the people. They came and began to work on the house of the Lord Almighty, their God. You hear that? They came and they started working. So they get this message from Haggai, and their response is exactly what God desires of them. So it's absolutely amazing. And what we see is that God places a desire in them. God does something in their spirit, puts something in their will to say, for them to desire God's things, for them to want to put God first. He puts that spark, that ignition in them, and they respond. And so they actually start rebuilding, and it's beautiful. And when you see the people of God come together in unity and start working on something, you are seeing God at work. I mean, have you ever had that experience where you've seen some people come together to serve someone else or to come together to worship God, and you all of a sudden see God's people come together and they're consumed, they're focused on God's work? Well, when you see that, you are seeing God in action. And that's really exciting, and that's why it's exciting to actually see that right here in the book of Haggai. But as we reflect on this, we might think of Jesus' words in Matthew 6. He says, why do you say, what shall we eat, or what will we wear, or what will we drink? For the pagans, they worry about such things. But you seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you as well. Jesus was saying, you know what? As you center your life around what God's doing in the world, once you make God's good news the center of your life, then you can expect God to be taking care of you. So you don't need to worry. Stop worrying and just focus on following me. And it's similar to, where are our priorities? What are we putting first? Who are we seeking first, above and before other things? And, I've been looking at the book of Haggai all week, studying it. And this has been convicting for me, right? Because I'm asking myself, is God at the center of my life? And I think we should all be asking that question. Is God at the center of my life? And, on the outside, it's easy for me to say yes because I'm a pastor. I'm at church every Sunday. I'm involved in ministries. I'm studying my Bible, right? And that's really good, but I've been forced to keep asking because I know God is starting in the heart. And so I'm saying, God, am I really letting you be the center of my heart? Are your desires becoming my desires? And the book of Haggai really makes us ask that question of ourselves. So the first message of God, chapter 1, you have a priorities problem, but the people respond beautifully. So then we get to the second message, which is chapter 2, verses 1 through 9. So chapter 2, we start off, God's going to say, keep working. I'm in the process. Keep working. I'm in the process. And this is about 1 month later. So, they've only been working for about a month here. About 1 month later, chapter 2, verse 1. In the second year of King Darius, on the 21st day of the 7th month, the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Speak to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, to Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest, and to the remnant of the people. So, he's addressing everybody. Ask them, who of you is left who saw this house in its former glory? How does it look to you now? Does it not seem like nothing? So you got to remember that the temple was destroyed about 65 years ago. And so some of the young ones at that time are still alive, and they've returned or they never left Judah. And so they saw Solomon's temple, and they knew the glory, or at least they knew the stories of what that temple was like. And as they start to begin the work, they're just realizing this is going to be an unimpressive temple. We don't have the gold overlays. We don't even have all the bronze for the different little functions of the temple. We don't have the manpower. This temple is just going to be a shadow of the former glory. So God knows that that's what many of them are thinking and feeling. And that's a discouraging place to be. It makes them want to give up. If it can't be as good as it used to be, why try? But this is what God says. But now be strong, Zerubbabel, declares the Lord. Be strong, Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest. Be strong, all you people of the land, declares the Lord, and work. Hear that? He says, be strong and work. This is what I covenanted with you when you came out of Egypt, and my spirit remains among you. Do not fear. So they're kind of moping, maybe mourning a little bit, and God's saying, be strong. I'm in the process. I know you don't have the manpower. I know the gold's been taken. That's not what God's asking for. He's asking for his temple to be restored and for the people to work. So he says, be strong and get to work. I'm in the process. You need to trust me. I know it's different than before. But I'm in the process. Reminds us of Philippians 1:6. He who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion. He who began a good work in you, in me, God's going to carry it on to completion. What step are we on in that journey? It might look like a high, it might look like a low at the moment. But God's in the process, and he's not giving up on you, so we can't give up on him in the process either. And so that's why God's calling them to work. And then he looks at the future. So look at verse 6. He says, look ahead with me. This is what the Lord Almighty says. In a little while, I will once more shake the heavens and the earth, the sea and the dry land. I will shake all the nations, and what is desired by all nations will come, and I will fill the house with glory, says the Lord. The silver is mine, the gold is mine. The glory of this present house will be greater than the glory of the former house, says the Lord Almighty, and in this place I will grant peace, declares the Lord Almighty. So he looks into the future and he says, once again, Jerusalem, Zion, is going to be the center. And the nations are going to come, and the nations are going to worship. God's not just going to be the center of religious life for the Jews. All the nations are going to recognize that he's God, and they're going to bring their worship. They're going to bring gold and silver. So God's saying, don't worry. Look into the future with me and see what I have in store, because great glory is coming back. And I'm going to bring peace. I'm going to bring shalom. There's not going to be wars. You won't need to lock your doors. There's going to be plenty of food. The land is going to be at rest. There is going to be goodness all around God's people. So he looks to the future. But I think this is good for us to think about too, right? Because he says, I'm in the process. I'm in the process, so keep working. And I think about that with the church, right? And I think God's saying, I know my church isn't perfect, but these are my people, and this is where I'm working. And I'm using my church to change the world. I'm using my church. So don't decide to give up on it. Instead, be strong. God is in the process. God is using his people to share his love and his grace and his truth with this world. So if God isn't giving up, then we shouldn't either. Keep working. God is in the process, and God is in his church. Even here, Rogue Valley Christian Church, God is working and accomplishing great things. And we can count on that. So that is the second message from the Lord. The third message comes in verse 10, and the section is chapter 2, verse 10 through 19. And here we see God saying, enjoy my blessing, but don't forget your past. Saying, enjoy my blessing, but don't forget your past. And when we start reading this, you're going to be like, I'm not seeing a lot of blessing here, but don't worry, it's in there, I promise. So verse 10, on the 24th day of the 9th month, in the 2nd year of Darius, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Haggai. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Ask the priests. So he directly addresses the priest, and they know the Levitical law. They know what's written back here in the back of our Bible about laws of defilement and cleanliness and things that related to being pure, to be around the temple or enter the temple or even be with the people of God. And he says this, if someone carries consecrated meat in the fold of their garment, and that fold touches some bread or stew, some wine, olive oil, or other food, does it become consecrated? So there would be meat that was sacrificed, and it would be holy to the Lord. And the priests, they actually got to take a cut of it because that was their food that they got through the week with, and that's how God had set it up in Leviticus. So if they put it in the fold of their garment as like a pocket to hold their meat to take it home, and then it touched the table and touched the olive oil and touched the wine, did all of a sudden the olive oil and the table and the wine become holy? And they say, no, it doesn't work like that. That's not true. That's not what happens. But then verse 13, Haggai says this, well, if a person defiled by contact with a dead body touches one of these things, does it become defiled? And they say, well, yes, it does become defiled. And you can go back and read that too. If you touch a dead body, you're unclean because God is associated with life and he is not associated with death. So if you touched a dead body, you had to go through a purification process. And in the meantime, everything you're touching is spreading that defilement or spreading that uncleanness. And so they're like, well, yes, you can spread the defilement if you don't take care of it and go through the purification. So then Haggai tells them why he's asking them these seemingly random questions about the law that he knew and they knew, but he still asked them. Verse 14, then Haggai said, so it is with you, or with this people and this nation in my sight, declares the Lord. Whatever they do and whatever they offer there is defiled. So this is a parable, and it's talking about the people. They didn't really touch a dead body, but they have a problem. They have a problem of they're ready to go work on the temple and get involved in God's work, but they're not dealing with the sin in their own lives. They're not dealing with the sin in the community. So they're getting busy with God's work while ignoring his righteousness, while ignoring obedience, while ignoring the sin that's in them and among them in their community. And it doesn't specifically say what is defiling them, if there's a specific sin or if it's general. But it really goes to show that action for God begins in the heart. Our actions for God, they begin in the heart, right? I can paint a beautiful mural for God, but it can fail to be an act of worship if my heart is actually in a place of hate and anger for God, right? Our actions proceed from our heart. And so Haggai's saying, things may look okay on the outside, but there's something you got to deal with. But it seems that this is more talking about the past. It seems like he's kind of talking about a couple months ago, because this prophecy is now about 3 months since that first prophecy, so they're beginning the work. And as I was reading through, it sounds like this day was a special day where they're getting ready to really get going on the temple. They've been gathering supplies, they've been delegating tasks, and they've been getting ready. And so maybe it's some kind of groundbreaking day, some ceremonial day where they're going to cut the ribbon and say, all right, here we go, God. But Haggai's reminding them, or the Lord's reminding them through Haggai, to check their hearts. And he goes on to say, let's jump to verse 18. He says, from this day on, from the 24th day of the 9th month, give careful thought. There it is again. Give careful thought to the day when the foundation of the Lord's temple was laid. Give careful thought. Is there yet any seed left in the barn? Until now, the vine and the fig tree, the pomegranate and the olive tree have not borne fruit. From this day on, I will bless you. So I told you it ended in blessing. God saying, I'm bringing my blessing right here, right now. But he says, don't forget, right now the fruit has been minimal. The harvest has not been plentiful. That's because I've been wanting you to return to me. I've been wanting you to get busy with my work, with the temple. And from this day on, you're going to notice a difference. You're going to witness my blessing in your lives. But as you keep doing the work and keep experiencing God's blessing, don't forget. Don't forget what it was like before. Don't forget life without my blessing. So that's why he says, enjoy my blessing. I want you to enjoy my blessing. But don't forget your past, and that your actions, they really begin in the heart. And wow, what about for us? What does that mean? Do you remember your life before God was a part of it? Do you remember your life before you surrendered it to someone greater than you? Do you remember your life before Jesus was the king of your life? Those are not and were not good days. Those were days without God. Those were days of being alone. Those were days without God's Spirit. And we need to remember that. We need to remember, we shouldn't forget what life was like before God. We shouldn't forget what life was like without God. That's important for us. And so enjoy my blessing, but don't forget your past. And this leads us to the final section. And in this final section, chapter 2, verses 20 through 23, God is saying, I have a big time plan, and I haven't forgotten my promises. I have a big time plan, and I haven't forgotten my promises. That's what God's saying. So again, he looks to the future. This is actually on the same day, so it's been a number of months since that initial prophecy. They started getting supplies, and now they're really ready to get going on the temple work. So Haggai says, don't forget your past. Don't forget life without God's blessing. And then now in verse 20, he's going to zero in and talk to Zerubbabel, the governor of Judah, specifically. Verse 20. The word of the Lord came to Haggai a second time on the 24th day of the month. Tell Zerubbabel, governor of Judah, that I am going to shake the heavens and the earth. I will overturn royal thrones and shatter the power of the foreign kingdoms. I will overthrow chariots and their drivers. Horses and their riders will fall, each by the sword of his brother. Whoa, so the power is going to be stripped away from the nations. God is going to turn things over. He's going to shake things up because he is going to reign. And so the power will be the Lord's, and it will not be these nations that are on top and in control. So this is a huge shakeup that's coming, something big, something in the future. So then he says, verse 23, on that day, declares the Lord Almighty, I will take you, my servant Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, declares the Lord, and I will make you like my signet ring, for I have chosen you, declares the Lord Almighty. So he says, I'm going to take you, my servant, Zerubbabel. And as we hear my servant, if you're familiar with the prophets, it's going to make you think of Isaiah. And it's going to make you think of these prophecies having to do with the Messiah. Because my servant and the Messiah are kind of linked themes or linked concepts as we read through the prophets. And so we're going, okay. What is God getting at here? Our ears are perked. We're wondering. And then we read Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel. Son of Shealtiel. Before he was calling him governor of Judah, governor of Judah. That was his role. That was his duty. That's what he did. But whose family is he from? Well, he's the son of Shealtiel. And if we trace that back, we start to realize, Zerubbabel, he is a descendant of David. And David was the one who got a promise that said, one from your line, one from your family will be my anointed one, will be my Messiah, and will sit on the throne. And so this promise to David, all of a sudden in Haggai, years later, after they've been to exile, they've been disciplined, they've returned, God's saying, I haven't forgotten my promise. And he says, you're going to be like a signet ring. And the king would have a signet ring that was their sign, their symbol. And whoever had it, they had the full standing, they had the full authority of the king. So this is powerful. You are a representative, a full representative of the king if you have their signet ring. What you write in signet is therefore like the king is saying it. So he's saying, Zerubbabel, you're going to be like my signet ring. You're going to represent me fully. So this is huge. This is some big language. And what's so cool is if you go ahead and turn to the book of Matthew. It's just a couple pages, a couple books, and then a couple pages over. So if you turn to the book of Matthew, chapter 1, we're going to see an amazing connection with the New Testament and with Jesus. So Matthew opens with a genealogy, and it starts with Abraham. As you see, verse 2 says from Abraham, and it goes all the way to David. And then verse 6, 7, it goes from David all the way to the exile to Babylon that we just talked about. Well, then verse 12, it says this. After the exile to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel. Shealtiel, the father of Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel, the father of Abihud. Abihud, the father of Eliakim. Eliakim, the father of Azor. And Azor to Zadok. From Zadok to Achim. From Achim to Elihud. From Elihud to Eleazar. From Eleazar to Matthan. From Matthan to Jacob. And Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary. And Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. We have the privilege of being on this side of the Messiah. Jesus is coming to earth. And yet we also get to see that Zerubbabel was a part of that family line. He was a part of the promise. He was a part of fulfilling God's big-time plan in big-time ways. And so it's exciting to connect these dots and see what God is up to. Well, as Jesus comes, and we see in the book of Matthew, and he fulfills all these prophecies, he comes not only as a representative of God, but as God to the world. He goes around and he teaches. And we actually find him in quite a few scenes in the New Testament, being back at the temple, being back at this restored, rebuilt temple. And actually, they finish the temple a few years later after Haggai, and they get it rebuilt and up and going. But then eventually Herod does even a bigger project to get the temple looking pretty fancy for the Jews. And so Jesus would go around and he would teach at or near the temple. But he says in Matthew 12, verse 6, he says, I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. He's teaching and he says, I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. And he was talking about himself, right? Because the temple, it was God's presence among the people. The temple was the sacred space in our space. It was God's reign and rule from this place. But now God had come in the person of Jesus. And he wasn't limited to one place. He would go around inviting people to follow him. He would go around and he would heal people. He would go around and he would show God's power by casting out demons. And so truly one greater than the temple was here. And one greater than the temple still lives and reigns and rules. And that is our Lord. That is Jesus. And so for us today, if Jesus is not only greater than the temple, but the greatest, how does that shape my life? How does that shape things? Jesus should be the center of our lives, right? Jesus and what he is doing in this world should be the center of our lives, the center of how we prioritize our life and what is important to us. And as we give our lives and surrender to Jesus, he really starts to shape that on a heart level. He starts to make his desires our desires, just like we saw him doing with the people, where he moved in their spirit to desire the rebuilding of the temple. And so Jesus is the greatest. He will become our greatest priority. And so our lives are going to get rearranged if we let Jesus be the center. It's gonna rearrange how we use our time, what seems important to us. It's going to rearrange how we spend our treasure, what we do with our money. And that's a hard one. I mean, I admit for me, that's a tough one, right? And it's going to rearrange how we use our talents. It's going to rearrange how we use the gifts and the skills he's given us and how we decide to apply those in our world. And I want to caution us, it's not quite as easy as just go be a missionary, right? It's not just think of the most hardcore thing you can think of to do for God and go do that, right? It might be for some of us, and we should take that seriously. Is God calling me to do something out of the box? Is he calling me to global missions? We should be honestly asking ourselves that question and see what God says. But I think for most of us, it's just going to be letting God be the center of the life he's given us. It's just going to be letting him be the center of the job we're already at or the stage of life we're already in. And just keep asking him, Lord, I want you to be the center. Show me how to make you my greatest priority. And that's really the message of the Book of Haggai and what the Book of Haggai has to speak to us today, right here, right now, as we worship Jesus Christ. And if you had an opportunity